Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Michael Stewart, and I am the Director of Education here at the OI Foundation. We are excited for everyone joining us here this evening. We're going to be talking with Dr. Brendan Lee about new medical research and or rather new medical treatments being studied for treating osteogenesis imperfecta. We're going to get started in just a few moments, but I want to go over some general housekeeping announcements before we dive into today's session and content. So, as I said before, my name is Michael Stewart, and I will be asking Dr. Lee a series of questions throughout this evening's program, which will run 1 hour long. We also received a large number of questions from the Zoom registration to sign up for this event, and we'll be trying to pepper those into the conversation as well. And in addition, if people have questions throughout today's session, me and my colleagues will be monitoring the Zoom chat. We welcome you to ask questions through there, and we will try to answer as many as we can that fit into today's topic as well. We're going to be doing our absolute best to try to keep this under 1 hour because we know it is evening or dinner time for many people on the East Coast and people have busy schedules. Also, I want to just send a reminder that this session is being recorded and we will post this on the OI Foundation's YouTube page afterwards. Also, captioning is available if you go to the bottom of the Zoom screen and you go to live transcript where you see the CC caption there, and you can use the captioning throughout today's session. With that being said, I'm going to jump into today's topic. So I want to introduce the speaker with us here today. If you have attended some of our past virtual events or in-person conferences in the past, you may have met already Dr. Lee. He is a member of the OI Foundation's Medical Advisory Council. In addition, he is the principal investigator for something called the Brittle Bone Disease Consortium, which we're going to go into a little bit more depth during today. And also, he is the chair of molecular and human genetics at Baylor College of Medicine. And we are very thankful to have him here with us today. So, Dr. Lee, thank you so much.
Hi, Michael. It's nice to see you and everyone.
Yeah. So
can you see, you're seeing the slide, right? It's all
yes,
shown.
I can see it clearly, and you sound good. Thank you so much.
Great.
So how we're going to be structuring this today is, so Dr. Lee has prepared a couple of visuals for us here today. Don't worry, this is not an hour-long lecture where, he's just going to be talking at us for a full hour. We want this to be as interactive as possible, but he has prepared a few visuals because some of the topics we'll be going over today are complicated. I work at the OI Foundation full-time for 4 years, and it is my job to know many of these topics. And as we were prepping for this, I was confused myself. So there is no shame there. If people want to ask clarifying questions at any point, feel free to type that in, and we'll try to slow down and make sure that we're getting that comprehension, because these are important and very interesting topics about the future of new potential drugs for treating OI. So I'm going to ask some kind of broad-ended questions, and then Dr. Lee is going to be talking about what the implications of those are and kind of giving us his answers. Before we sort of jump into any of the content, Dr. Lee, do you have anything you want to talk about before we jump in?
No, I think, again, we're open. We want this to be interactive. I think I just prepared a few slides to cover the really high-level questions that Mike will ask, and then we'll open it up. I would underscore an important point, which is a disclaimer, and I think Michael alluded to it. Especially now in the world that we're living in, science is sometimes being attacked on multiple levels. And it is important that when we think about science and the research we do, it is an inexact process. And I think, Francis Collins said it well. Would we be upset if a week ago, a stock advisor tells us this stock is now doing well? And now today in this week, he might say, in fact, with new information, the stock's going to do terrible. Well, science is like that. We are always doing research, and we have to recalibrate what we know. And so keep in mind that everything I'm saying today is based on, sort of my read of the best available information, but it may change, and we need to always keep that principle in mind so that science is constantly evolving. And I think you all live that when you think about how we treat OI. So I just wanted to remind us of that because you made me think about that in your introduction.
Oh, thank you. And actually, speaking of disclaimers, I apologize for not bringing this up before. This is the announcement I make at every session that we do. So just as a reminder to us and our audience, so today's session is not telemedicine. And what we mean when we say that is so I or Dr. Lee or any of the medical professionals on today's call or any of the other calls that OI Foundation does, we cannot answer your specific medical inquiries. So while people can ask questions that are personal to them in the Zoom chat, and we may be able to address some of those in a broad sense, we cannot answer your specific medical questions because of various rules and laws in the United States. So just please be aware of that as you are typing your question. Feel free to, if you have a question you're not sure, and you feel comfortable putting that into the chat, feel free to type that question, but just want to provide that disclaimer ahead of time. So I think with that being said, thank you so much, Dr. Lee. I want to just jump into the first big question I have. So, and this is kind of obviously why we're here. So what are some of the current drug treatments being used in OI now, and how do they work?
Sure. That's a question we often get a lot. And this is a slide I often use in my talks. And it helps to give us a basis of understanding how the drugs we use in OI work. And an important point is that they're all been really adopted from the study of these drugs in the world of osteoporosis. So, osteoporosis being a common disease that afflicts many of us, especially as we become more mature, where we have increased fragility of bone, mostly often in adults. And what we know from the many, many studies in osteoporosis is that there are really two major classes of drugs. Ones that build bone, or anabolic drugs, versus those that block the resorption or the breakdown of bone, called anti-resorptives. And so if you think about what happens in bone, is a bone content, the amount of bone that's present. And then there are bone-forming cells, the osteoblasts, on the left here, and bone resorbing cells. And so think of it as a balance in terms of how much bone you have. And we know from many, many years of research in the osteoporosis world that things like exercise and supplementing with calcium and vitamin D, calcium being an important part of bone, vitamin D being a hormone that controls this balance, as well as the fuel, i.e. calcium that goes into bone, is something that is effective and is a first-line treatment. And this is why, in OI, in fact, we often talk about how we have to have appropriate levels of vitamin D and calcium, not too much, because too much of any treatment can be bad, as well as some ability to stimulate bone, because that is important for bone formation and resorption. Now, the medication that I think many of you are already familiar with from the world of osteoporosis are these bisphosphonates. And these are, in fact, the standard drugs that block bone resorption, the breakdown of bone. And they inhibit this. So you can imagine that if you block breakdown of bone, you can get more bone. And some of the names of the medications include permethrin, which is the trade name is most commonly Aredia, zoledronic acid, or Zometa, which are IV drugs, alendronate and risedronate, and the trade names are Fosamax and Actinol. So these are examples of medications that many of you may have seen or have been used, but again, they derive from osteoporosis literature. Another medication that is, again, works on this side of the equation or balance is an antibody against a protein in the body called rank ligand, or RANKL. And this works like bisphosphonates, but are even more effective in blocking the formation here of these bone resorbing cells, osteoclasts. And the antibody is named, the generic name is denosumab, and the trade name is Prolia. There's much less experience in sort of adapting this osteoporosis treatment, this approved osteoporosis treatment, in the context of OI. Now, on the other side of the equation, bone formation, stimulating osteoblasts, so making more bone. An FDA approved treatment for osteoporosis, again, for osteoporosis, is parathyroid hormone, or a form of parathyroid hormone called PTH. The most common is teriparatide, and the trade name is Forteo. There are now newer ones called baloparatide, but same class. And it turns out that these drugs can stimulate bone formation. And in fact, as you may remember my talking about this, we had done a trial on this in OI, and others are also have done clinical trials with this in OI. And then the most sort of new drug on the block, again, for osteoporosis, not approved for OI, is another antibody that blocks another protein that's in the body called sclerostin. And this drug is called romosozumab, which is approved, again, for osteoporosis, and the trade name is Evenity. So now there are many drugs that work on both sides of the equation, again, primarily derived from the world of, not primarily, but really derived from the world of osteoporosis treatment, approved for osteoporosis treatment, that have been applied off-label, so as we call it, in the context of OI, with bisphosphonates being really the standard that we have the most information on.
Thank you. So there's a lot here. And I think that a lot of our community members, if they are on the call with us now or they're watching a recording of this, they'll particularly notice that, they may recognize some of these names here. I'm thinking specifically of all these bisphosphonates and, their different names that they're on the right-hand side. You're also talking a bit about, prescription treatments or things that you go into a clinic for versus, more, I want to say, at home, like calcium and vitamin D and exercise. These are not necessarily things that have to happen in a doctor's office or with a prescription. I'm curious, though, specifically on when you talk about how things get approved. So I know that in the past few years, we've heard a lot in the news about FDA approval. Obviously, I think it comes up in the evening news most days about talking about COVID vaccines, but specifically for our purposes, when we say a drug is approved for a certain use, so if you brought up anti-sclerostin being approved for osteoporosis, but not for treating OI, what does that mean? What is that difference? And how does drugs get developed? And thank you.
So that brings us to this slide on drug development. And so it is really important to understand each of our roles in this process. And it is a complex process leading to ultimately approval of a drug by the FDA if you are in the US. But that doesn't always happen. And in fact, there are no FDA approved medications right now for osteogenesis imperfecta. Now, the first step of drug approval, which I won't cover, but a lot of times this is what you read in the newsletters or in papers, is all the work that we do on the preclinical side, meaning before we get to human subjects and participants. This is the work that we do in cells, in animal models, and the OI Foundation has been a big driver of this research. This is the foundational basic science work that leads you to a candidate or a target or a potential drug to actually test. And so I'm not going to cover this because this is more on the basic science side. Now, what is important is, in fact, what occurs on the clinical side. And so to ask whether a drug works or can work in the context of a disease, we have to do clinical research, which means that we have to work with you, the patients, as participants. Now, there are many phases of clinical study and clinical development, if in fact one's goal is to get to FDA approval. It's important to understand that you can do many of these elements without formally getting FDA approval. And so these are potentially important studies. And in fact, there have been many such studies over the years, but none of them have so far led to FDA approvals. And there are many reasons for that. Initially, there's a phase 1 study, which asks whether a medication has toxicity associated with it. This can be often done in healthy volunteers, or it could be done with individuals with the disease it's targeting to treat. Then that proceeds to phase 2 studies, which ask the question, well, what is the right dose of specific medication? And again, this can be informed by other studies that are already existing. They can be informed by actually FDA approval of that drug in a different indication. So again, phase 2 study focuses on dose. the most important phase is the phase 3 study, which is whether a drug is efficacious, meaning in the context of a clinical trial, in a design looking at specific measures of whether something is efficacious or effective. That is what is required ultimately at a certain level or rigor to get to FDA approval. Now, we live in the world of rare disease, and a lot of times these phases can actually be combined because, as you know, there are not a lot of patients with OI compared with osteoporosis. And this is why oftentimes the FDA may provide approval for a drug with a request or a requirement for a phase 4 study, meaning that in fact you have to continue to follow patients to look for potential signs of toxicity or other things that could not be identified because of the small number of patients which are often studied in this process in clinical trials. Now, what is key is you can do all of these things and not get to FDA approval. And FDA approval means that, in fact, a group has worked with the FDA and they've agreed with the design and the power of a certain set of these studies, and that, in fact, it has reached a certain endpoint in comparing whether the drug is effective either against something called placebo, which means basically no treatment, or with a standard of care that's already existing. So there are situations for that. But one can do all of this and not get to FDA approval. So that's very important to keep in mind. And FDA approval is critical because it is a stamp that a drug has a certain level of efficacy and side effects that we understand. And two, it is often a requirement for, not often, but almost always, a requirement for payers, insurance companies, to pay for that drug. And so that's a very important point to also keep in mind in our certain healthcare system.
Thank you. Just looking at how you've laid this out too. So correct me if I'm wrong, preclinical this is before this treatment, this drug is being tested on people, correct? And then clinical
Correct.
is on people. Can I ask,
Yes.
is there a point where, and obviously, these numbers may not, can you approximate, like, where do you, particularly for rare bone disease treatments, like treatments treating OI, is there a point where most of them get stuck?
Sure. That's an excellent question. In sort of traditional drug development, almost always we're very effective in this first part, identifying a target, a lead that can be tested. You can test it in animal models, and it can be very effective. The sort of the chasm, the gap that often occurs is at this level of toxicity, where when you go into patients or participants, whether with the disease you're treating or healthy adults, that there's toxic or side effects that prevent its use. And certainly the bar for that is different for chronic versus more acute life-threatening diseases. So, and again, this is not a sort of a standard that is the same for every disease. It's a risk-benefit assessment that occurs throughout this. And then that's, if you get past that, then of course you're moving forward to the downstream. But it's often at this phase where there is a major challenge. What I would say, though, with rare diseases especially, another major challenge is at the efficacy phase, because it turns out that when you're looking at what we call endpoints, how do you determine when a drug is effective? The FDA often requires what they view as clinically significant events. And so, for example, in OI, it may be fractures, obviously. But as all of you know who have OI, the number of fractures can change in the stage of your life. The number of fractures can be different depending upon whether you get an X-ray to measure it. You might even just think you have a fracture, but you don't always get an X-ray. So detecting it could be a challenge. And then finally, the severity of how many fractures one might get we know varies with the type of OI. And again, that all impacts something called the power of the phase 3 study. Just to give you calibration, when these large drug companies are developing all those medications I talked about with osteoporosis, bisphosphonates, teriparatide, anti-sclerostin, we're often talking about numbers in the thousands. Clinical trials in the phase 3 with 2,000 to 3,000 individuals. And that's for a condition, osteoporosis, where compared to OI, it's actually much more homogeneous, meaning that the number of fractures can be much better predicted over a large population. Because of all of these issues, it's actually very difficult with something like fractures as a primary endpoint to power a study appropriately to get thousands and thousands of OI patients, which we know is very difficult to do in rare disease. So for rare disease, it's not just phase 1 in toxicity. One of the challenges is, in fact, being able to design a properly powered phase 3 study. And these are the obstacles, and why I would say, in spite of many excellent clinical studies done to date, we still don't have an FDA-approved drug.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And I think we're going to ask more questions about how that's decided a little bit later as well, because you brought up a lot of very fascinating points. So we've talked about, this kind of general structure of drug development here, and also the FDA's overall larger role. Another organization we want to talk about is specifically the BBDC, or the Brittle Bone Disorders Consortium. So you are the principal investigator for this organization, and a lot of times we will use it interchangeably sometimes with the OI Foundation, or the OIF and the BBDC, and sometimes you will see their logos right next to each other. But could you explain just very briefly again, for those who have not attended some of our past sessions, what is the BBDC and what is its role in this process here?
Sure. So as some of you may know, the BBDC is a consortium, a group of investigators at different sites. I'm here at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. There are 12 such sites around North America, and additional ones funded by the OI Foundation directly. And the NIH, National Institutes of Health, the major biomedical funding agency in our country, invests in us via grant funding to, in fact, establish this sort of side of the equation, clinical research centers, not preclinical, so we don't work on animals or cells. It's really about clinical research to achieve two things, actually. One is very important, is clinical trial readiness. And this is exactly what we've been talking about. How do we determine what's the right number of patients in these types of studies? What are in fact the complications in the natural history of the disease? Because it's only with that you can design an appropriate trial. So we're focused, with your help, on many aspects of the natural history to understand what is the frequency of fracture in this type versus that type, what are the other complications in terms of the lungs or the heart, and all of these things factor into the discussion of how do you design a proper trial to ask whether a drug is safe and efficacious, and especially when you discuss this with the FDA. So I would say that is the most important goal of the BBDC. And in fact, with your help, we are now in year 7 to 8 of this, and we hope to continue because we're getting amazing data out of this longitudinal process. The other element is that, in fact, do some of these clinical trials. And this is a recent publication that we're very proud of that came out of the BBDC, where we targeted and studied this molecule TGF-beta as a potential treatment for osteogenesis imperfecta. Now, what is important to keep in mind is when we did this study, it was a phase 1 study focused on whether it's safe. Now, we can always look at efficacy as part of phase 1 studies. As I touched on, you can always look at those, but they're considered secondary endpoints. And importantly, the BBDC's role is not to get a drug approved. In general, the National Institutes of Health, except in situations where you have a massive health emergency like COVID, really focuses on early phase clinical studies like phase 1. And in fact, part of the BBDC is to do studies like that are in this phase 1/2 situation. We would hope to empower partners, especially in industry, to in fact take this all the way through to the FDA. And that is the model in the US. Most FDA approved therapies are driven by industry and drug companies. And that's how the system works. What we hope to do is to provide the foundation so that drug companies can use this data to design the best trials, and in fact, in perhaps even stimulate them to pursue targets and in this process. And so this is a good example where we think this has worked effectively, but again, there are many, many sort of inputs into this process of getting to FDA approval.
Thank you. So lots of very interesting points there. One thing I'm thinking of, particularly right now that you brought up, was the role of, sometimes we use the phrase industry partners, or specifically what we mean here is pharmaceutical companies. So you talk about how, like, almost, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you might have used something along the lines of like crossing the finish line, or like, can you explain that process a little bit more and the general role that pharmaceutical companies take in this drug development? Because I'm looking over at the previous slide you showed, and I'm seeing lots of familiar names and lots of medical advisory council members of the OIF and people that I know are not pharmaceutical reps or pharmaceutical employees. Like, what does that relationship look like?
Right. So, when you think about how one of the things that has distinguished our country from the rest of the world is our investment in biomedical research. And this is set up in a specific format, which is that the public, we, via our tax dollars, invest in basic and clinical research to try to improve health. And this is the kind of work that I've talked about with the BBDC. But our system is designed that, in fact, it is partnership by industry that will take those drugs into the context of FDA approval and to make it available to many, many, many patients widely, both in our country and hopefully outside of our country. And so that is how the design works. In fact, there was a very important law that was passed many, many years ago called the Bayh-Dole Act, which actually incentivizes this because it provides the intellectual property from discoveries like what we did with TGF-beta and others to actually the research institution doing the work. This has come up a lot in sort of our government and discussions. Why doesn't the government oftentimes own the intellectual property on discoveries around drugs that they actually help to fund? And it's because of this Bayh-Dole Act, actually. It was designed to stimulate investment from the private sector and industry, and it has worked enormously well. This is why we, among any other country in the world, lead in developing treatments. Now, there are side effects of that, and that's a separate issue, a separate discussion regarding then the cost of some of these medications. But outside of that, no one would argue that our system leads to really this model of investment and getting to drugs to market. And again, it's partly the issue of expanding our trial. So let me give you an example. In that phase 1 study that we did with using an approach of blocking TGF-beta, it was really a 2-site trial in the BBDC. We have 12 sites, but only the Baylor site and OHSU participated, partly because of the availability of funding, which is always limiting. And this is why that the hope is that these sort of pilot type studies, almost, they're not pilot per se, but these types of studies would then incentivize a broadening of the trial. And this is often done primarily by industry, where instead of 2 or 3 sites funded by the NIH, you might have 10, 20, or even 30 sites to rapidly accrue the subjects and participants to actually do this pivotal phase 3 study. And in fact, that is sort of the model. So our industry partners are critical. It is how our system is set up. They are the ones who will ultimately get drugs to FDA approval. Now, again, it's not to say we don't have treatments for OI. Obviously, patients are being treated today with these medications like bisphosphonates, and some of them can be effectively standard of care, even though they're not FDA approved. But it's important to keep in mind that payers do not have to pay for them. And I know for a fact, we've had lots of adult patients who sometimes have many challenges getting access to some of these medications. Oftentimes, we can try to bypass that by, using the osteoporosis as an indication. But again, it's a challenge that prevents a widespread sort of accessibility to the most state-of-the-art treatments in this situation. I would say that, in terms of getting to industry partners, there are two major studies, which are, one is active and one is been announced, which I think are very hopeful in the sense of having, and we're lucky to have industry, partner with the OIF and with the BBDC. In fact, both of these drug companies, Sanofi being one and Osteogenesis collaborating with Mereo being the other, have interacted with both the investigators of the BBDC as well as investigators outside of the BBDC, as well as collaborating to look at some of our data to help to inform their studies. Because at the end of the day, our primary goal is to work together, certainly to get treatments to market so that they're FDA approved, so payers will cover them. And these two are studies which are in process and have been announced. In fact, one by Osteogenesis and Mereo focus on studying that osteoporosis approach of blocking sclerostin, but with their own drug in patients with OI. And some of the folks on this call may have participated in the early phases of this study. And the Sanofi has licensed from us this approach with anti-TGF beta to study in patients with adults with osteogenesis imperfecta. So again, I think that the investment in the BBDC, the research, the partnership with the OIF has in fact delivered, in the sense that in this drug development process, we now have drug companies who are leading this next phase to try to get these drugs through pivotal studies and hopefully to market. And that should be the goal, is to get as many treatments to market, because at the end of the day, that's how we can provide really the best care for our patients. There's never going to be one drug that does it all. And there probably will be many drugs that have their specific roles in condition as heterogeneous as osteogenesis imperfecta.
Great, thank you so much. It's also making me realize too that another reason for wanting to get as many drugs to market as possible is I'm thinking about also price considerations for the patient. Is it a concern that because we're talking about a rare disease community, and this is not necessarily about OI specifically or about those companies that you just put up, this is a general question. Is it a concern that because we're dealing with a rare group of, a rare disease, so it's a small group of people by definition, that this might increase the cost of an eventual to-market medication?
Absolutely. And that is also sort of the flip side of our system, right, in terms of the healthcare costs. And there's been a lot of discussions around this issue. Certainly, as amazing as the Bayh-Dole Act has been for stimulating capital investment in therapies and drug development of all types, the Orphan Drug Act similarly has done its part. As many of you know, is a very critical drug act which has facilitated drug development and especially among rare disease. And it is having a very positive impact. What is clear is that developing drugs in our system costs a lot of money, and there's no question about that. And obviously, because of that, that money has to be recovered as part of the sales of these medications. And one of the fastest growing components of our health expenditure in our health system is, in fact, rare disease drugs. It's wonderful because it means that we are getting treatments to patients who are in great need. But obviously, the flip side of that is the cost. And as many of you know, a lot has been written on this area, that these are very, very expensive drugs, often in the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. And so, I think that that's a societal issue of whether government and the public would come to an agreement of whether there has to be some type of control over that. That's not my role to make that decision, but can there be approaches where one can both incentivize capital investment, which is what makes our system great, but also at some point cap it with a return back to the public. So I mean, I think that that's an ongoing discussion. What I would say is, irrespective of that discussion that may take forever to solve, I think what we can do from the scientific and the patient side is exactly get more drugs to market, because the way capitalism works is competition. And so therefore, it's good for patients to have many options, and it's good for the economy to have many options. And so, in general, monopolies are bad. And this is why we have the Antitrust Act in the US. I don't mean to criticize those of you who might work for Google or Facebook, but what I would say is, competition is a bedrock of how capitalism works, and I think that's true in the health system also.
Thank you so much. So thank you, Dr. Lay. I'm going to jump now to some of the questions that we got in registration and also some of the questions that I see coming into the chat. And just a reminder to people that if you want to ask us a question, actually don't send me privately a question, send it to the whole group. And that just helps me and my colleagues keep track of questions better. So in the registration questions, we got kind of a couple of different categories of questions. A bunch were, so some were about, asking about specific new treatments that, like, could this work for OI? Others were about what do we know about treatments we're already using? And I want to start with those first, and then we can go to like potential hypothetical new treatments, and also deeper questions about what you just covered. So one is about, can you talk about, are there any studies or potential hazards and long-term impacts of people with OI who have been taking bisphosphonates, some of whom for maybe decades? Because as you had brought up, this is basically the standard of care. It is also not technically FDA approved for people with OI. And has that long-term impact been studied at all?
Yeah, I think we're studying it in the BBDC. Many centers have studied this issue because, as you pointed out, since the original work in the 1990s by Francisco Loria and others, it's been sort of evolving as a standard of care for now almost 2 decades. And so I think we do know there are side effects, and some of these were predicted by preclinical studies in animal models, and especially by the literally millions of lives treated with this in the osteoporosis world. And so I think probably, and it would take a whole hour to talk about the potential side effects. But again, it's really more the risk benefit. And I think we all agree that the potential benefit that we see, and I think patients see, especially children, have outweighed the risk. And one risk that we know is that when bisphosphonates suppress bone resorbing cells, it also suppressed bone forming cells because the two talk to each other. So one of the consequences of long-term bisphosphonate use, which happens in all cases almost, is that you suppress bone turnover and you can get to what we call potentially adynamic bone. And the most obvious consequence of this is, and I think some of you have been on for, children who started in their infancy and have been on for 2 decades, is that when they get a fracture at that point, because obviously bisphosphonate doesn't necessarily fix the quality of the bone and patients can still fracture, they can have a problem healing the bone, because to heal the bone, you need to have active remodeling. And so that's a common side effect we, and I think many of the doctors here in this call probably see in the very long-term patients. There are other reported effects. When you look at a drug, there are a long list of them, but I would say that's certainly something that we see and we're collecting data on in the BBDC, and I think other sites have similarly reported on.
Thank you. Also, I'm thinking back to that first slide you put up with all the different treatments available to people now with the scale. So there are all these different classes of medications. When a clinician is seeing a patient with OI and thinking about what types of drug treatments to use, how are they making those choices? What is that choice dependent on?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. And I would say there are many factors, and some factor in more than others, but may change in the future. As a geneticist, I would hope one day in the world of personalized medicine that in fact, the gene mutation you have and the kind of OI you have would inform that choice. We're not at that point. We're far from that point. But I think that that's what the promise of personalized medicine would be about. And in fact, if we have many new drugs formally approved and we understand the genetics and the mutations effect on long-term natural history, that could happen. So I mean, that is a really an important goal of all of us, and that's what we should strive for. There's no question.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Just so I'm understanding you, when you talk about like those personalized, individualized treatments, is this kind of like when you hear about CRISPR in the news? Is that what you're talking about? Or is
Well,
that
no, not necessarily. CRISPR is an approach of therapy. It's not a it is more akin to personalized in the sense that CRISPR can be used to edit or change a specific mutation. That's maybe the ultimate in personalized medicine, that you're actually fixing the mutation that's present in your body. We're far from that. But that is, I would say, the ultimate manifestation of personalized medicine. Now, what is practically done today, I think, is, what do we have most experience with? And there is no question the most experience we have with is bisphosphonates, both in OI and in osteoporosis. And that often is the first line treatment in many cases, balanced by practicalities, meaning will an insurance company pay for that treatment? So you might think a specific treatment may be best for a patient. So for example, on the bone formation side, we showed years ago that teriparatide in a clinical trial was actually very effective in mild forms of OI, type 1 OI. But again, whether a payer would in fact pay for that as an initial treatment is a big part that factors into what a doctor can or cannot use in that context. I think that that's another factor. Obviously, the severity of the patient, whether a drug treatment is even indicated at that point. Many OI type 1 patients, for example, may not be treated. So there are lots of clinical variables. There are economic variables. There are the potential for personalized medicine variables that factor into this. And another important dividing point is a child versus an adult. The rapidly growing skeleton of a child certainly makes bisphosphonates very effective from that perspective. In an adult, where the skeleton is already sort of not making as much bone, may impact the effectiveness there. So lots of questions, and unfortunately not as many clear answers in terms of definitive trials yet.
Thank you. Another genre of questions I'm seeing is about, it's really coming from an international perspective. So you talked a lot about the US drug development process. But I'd imagine some people on this call stay with us now or dialing in, not from the United States. And the OI community is everywhere in the world. Does approval in other countries influence, say, that FDA process in any way? And also, we had another question that sort of the part two is, could you talk about stem cell therapy a little bit, which seems to be studied in other countries, but not in the United States?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. What therapy?
The second part was about stem cell therapy.
Stem cell therapy.
Being practiced overseas,
Yep.
but not in the United States. So could you just elaborate on why?
Sure.
So the first part is, does the drug approval process in other countries, does that impact the FDA's process or clinical development within the United States?
Sure. So there's no question that every country or union, in the case of the European Union, has their own equivalent of the FDA. Canada has their equivalent of the FDA. The European Union has the EMA, the European Medicines Agency. So there's corresponding regulatory agencies in all these different domains. The applications which are submitted by drug companies, in most cases, for approval for a drug are independent. While the data can be the same, and there can be cross-referencing of some of that data, it is an independent process. And so, while the FDA is certainly sensitive to when a drug is approved by the EMA, for example, it doesn't impact necessarily its own requirements. And in fact, the requirements are different in terms of various aspects of, the check on drug production and all the different paths to making a drug, not just the clinical trial itself. And because of these differences, the FDA is often held as sort of the high bar for drug companies to get approval. That's not to say that drugs that are approved in different places are not safe, but again, the processes and requirements are different and are sensitive to different geographies and needs. So does that answer your first question?
It does, yes.
Yeah. So I mean, a good example is, I mean, we hear about so much of that is COVID, right? There are vaccines approved right now in Europe and in the rest of the world that are not yet approved in the US. And so it just gets at sort of, again, there are just differences and many things factor into that. The second question was about stem cell therapy. I think that the idea of stem cell therapy is both intriguing, but also been around for a long time. Stem cell therapy in its rudimentary form started with bone marrow transplantation in the 60s. And so the idea of producing, giving a patient a stem cell that would then change or differentiate, become a cell type that would function normally or appropriately in the body is not new. I think the challenge of stem cell therapy for skeletal diseases has always been the fact that the skeleton is so diverse and exists, in all parts. Sort of, it is the structure of the body. Also, it is a system where the cells are embedded in a matrix. So unlike blood, which turns over very quickly and is in fact replaced, and this is why, if you think about successes of stem cell therapy, bone marrow transplantation and all the derivative downstream of that has been the greatest success. It's because that system is sort of optimal for stem cell therapy. The skeletal system with osteoblasts and osteoclasts and osteocytes, which are in fact 98% of the skeleton. I didn't even touch on that, and that's embedded in bone. To try to replace that is not easy. So I think conceptually there are challenges. The other challenge of stem cell therapy is not only do you have to replace them, you have to generate a niche where you can differentiate and to get into that neighborhood, so to speak. Again, when bone marrow transplantations have worked, you often, and still today, you have to ablate the existing marrow. You have to get rid of the folks who live in the neighborhood before you can get new folks to move into the neighborhood, so to speak. And that's not so easy to do in the skeleton, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
In the blood. So there are all these conceptual challenges. Now, the other question is how many of the cells in the skeleton do you have to replace to have a benefit? We don't know. We really don't know about that. And so I think that that's been one of the reasons where stem cell therapies as a class have been hindered in the world of skeletal diseases like OI. Why are there trials going on in Europe as opposed in the US? That's probably more of a philosophical and funding question, because the question is who's funding those studies, right? So it's a priority. And in one country, there may be more excitement over something versus another. And so I think there's that factor in terms of funding that is part of the equation also.
Great, thank you. Moving on, I want to talk about more questions about sort of pre-existing treatments that are available now. I just lost my place, my apologies. Sorry, I missed my place in my notes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the two studies that you brought up today. So the two companies taking those on right now, one was Sanofi and the other one was Ultragenyx. Can you just say the names of do you know the names of those two studies specifically, or any identifying information? We have a few comments in the chat.
Sure. I mean, I can bring it up again. These are straight from the clinicaltrials.gov. So any of you can look that up in clinicaltrials.gov. So in the US, the clinicaltrials.gov is a major database that all clinical trials are registered with, and it gives you information in terms of recruitment and sites. And so these are the two studies. I don't have the clinicaltrials.gov numbers, but I pulled these directly from there. You can just, again, search for it. And you can if you're interested, find sites that are interested, or that are recruiting eventually.
Right. So if a community member in the United States wanted to see if they were eligible or wanted to learn more about those, the best way to go to clinicaltrials.gov. Correct?
That has certainly foundational information.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, when the study is active, you can get information from the drug company directly, but also from the sites where there are which are doing the clinical investigation. So you'll see those listed in clinicaltrials.gov, and the OIF has information. And the OIF has always been a source of important information, and I think that's obviously another source. Whether a subject or a patient is a candidate, it depends on the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So in any of the trials, whether they're phase 1, 2, 3, there are inclusion and exclusion criteria because, again, it depends on how the study is designed. So, for example, in the Sanofi trial, they're studying primarily adults, but in the Osteogenesis study, I think both adults and children are being studied. So, again, there are going to be detailed requirements that will have to be vetted before someone can participate.
Great. So actually, that brings me up to another question I had about eligibility of certain studies. And so this is larger than just these two studies just put up there. But, so the OI Foundation has a registry where community members can sign up and they will get contacted about potential research projects that they could,
Right, the contact registry.
The contact registry that they can take part of and, further the scientific understanding of OI. I think it's an incredible way to get involved with the community that's relatively low effort, something you can do right now. Sign up for an email and we'll send you a very occasional email with something that, that may or may not apply to you. One thing that we see in many OI studies is that they have pretty strict criteria for who can participate and who can't. Some things that, like I've seen before, and I'm just wondering if you could sort of expand upon why this is often structured in certain ways, or maybe these are challenges that researchers face about why do certain studies only only asking for volunteers in certain cities or locations? And it seems very narrow. And then another question is, what makes researchers pick certain types of OI over others, particularly when we feel like there's, for many clinicians, there feels to be a movement towards describing OI in broader terms to begin with, like, describing it as mild, moderate, severe. But meanwhile, they're asking for type 4 participants in the city of Chicago, or as an example.
Sure.
Can you explain?
Yeah, and this really has to do with sort of clinical trial dynamics and implementation. And this is also why, there's a difference between whether you show a drug is efficacious in the context of a clinical trial versus what is the real world effectiveness of that drug when you roll it out to all patients. Mm-hmm. So those are different. And you touch on some of those issues. And I touched on some of those issues also. Remember, I touched on the concept of whether you can design a trial that is, quote, properly powered to show whether a drug is efficacious, depending upon what are the primary measures of efficacy. I used the example in osteoporosis of fracture incidence, how many fracture occurs in a year.
When you say properly powered, what do you mean?
So meaning from a design perspective, can you get enough patients enrolled in the trial to show a statistically significant difference? Okay. So it's really a statistical consideration of whether you can in fact detect a difference. So let me just say practically the following. Let's assume drug A is in fact, it works and it's better than placebo. But how well it works, meaning the effect size, helps to determine how many patients you may need to study in that trial. In addition, another factor that determines how many patients you need to study in that trial is what you're measuring in that trial and how the measures vary from patient to patient. So those are three important concepts in any clinical trial. What is the effect size? How strongly effective is that drug? How many patients you study is very important because that addresses feasibility and is determined by the effect size of the drug and what you're measuring as a marker of that effectiveness and how variable that is in that population. And so these concepts really are what go into this idea of the design of a trial, how many subjects, and then the criteria. Because for example, you pointed out, well, do you just study adults or children, or do you study type 3 versus type 4? This all gets on this idea of how variable the population is. And so what we as scientists and drug companies often do, and whether you're a scientist in a drug company or a scientist in working in the nonprofit sector, is you have to design a feasible experiment. And this is why you have all these criteria. I alluded to them, inclusion criteria, to try to get the best defined experiment that you can actually detect something. Because it's unethical to design and get patients to participate in a trial if we really don't think we're going to be able to detect the difference we are hypothesizing about, or that our preclinical studies and other data suggest we can see. So it's one of those design challenges that really make us have to have these very strict, oftentimes what seem like very strict criteria in terms of participation. I would also add that the geography part is, again, a practical issue. It's enormously expensive and takes a lot of infrastructure to develop these clinical trials. And oftentimes they're at sites where there is a large, academic center or a big practice that can, in fact, take on the challenges of this. So that's, again, so there's a lot of practical, scientific as well as operational issues that determine where and how the trial is performed.
Great. Thank you. Dr. Lee, so we have 2 minutes left. So I'm going to give you a time limit on this question just because I want to be within time for everyone. And this is my last question for this evening is, in 5 or 10 years, I'll let you pick the time frame. What do you think is a realistic best case scenario for what the future of treating OI looks like?
Sure. Well, I think with these 2 studies that I just showed, I think it's really exciting because drug companies are incentivized to try to be as quick and as fast as possible. And, when you get a sense, and I've been in this, rare disease therapeutic research area for many years now, trials can get done in the rare disease space in a matter of, 2 to 4 years. So, I could imagine that in the span of, that time that one could get the data to know whether there is hope to, in fact, move forward with either of these types of treatment. Now, obviously, it depends on what phase you're in. If you're just starting phase 1, it may be that it would be a little bit longer. But I'd certainly, it's not going to be 10 or 20 years. I would say that. Once you've started this process of, phase 1, 2, 3, 4 sort of context. In rare disease. I'm not talking about common disease necessarily. Yeah. So I do think it's really exciting for us as a community because I think the investment that the OI Foundation and the families, because you're at the end of the day, your participation is what drives it, has gotten us to this point. I think in the context of rare bone diseases, a lot has happened in the past 5 to 10 years in terms of clinical trial readiness and hopefully stimulating some of these industry studies now. We're really at the cusp here, so it's exciting. For some of the other studies, I saw in the chat, there were questions about gene therapy, CRISPR type therapies. That's a little bit further down that pipeline. And part of it is not because they're less worthy or less effective. I think they're just, again, more, potential operational, structural challenges in getting those to the skeleton. There's no question that gene therapy is a reality now. I work on gene therapy in the skeleton, and CRISPR is working in blood diseases. It's funny, blood diseases are often at the forefront in terms of novel therapies, partly because they're so, I don't want to insult my hematologist colleagues, but it's an easily accessible tissue, right? The blood. and the stem cells in the blood. The skeleton is just much more of a challenge, but that's okay. This is why all of us are working together to keep on advancing this and pushing this forward. And a lot has already happened in the context of OI in the past decade alone.
Great. Dr. Lee, thank you so much for joining us this evening. This was incredibly informative. As always, I really enjoyed talking to you. To everyone on the call, we want to thank you so much for joining us. I see my colleagues posted links to the OI registry, which you can access there. And we'll be recording, we've been recording the session. We'll post it on YouTube in the next few days. Dr. Lee, thank you so much for everything you do for us. And I hope everyone has a good evening. Thank you all.
Take care, everyone. It's great seeing you.